Hey guys, MexPlained here. Today we're going to dive into why bolted joints are so much stronger than you think. So bolted joints are used wherever we want to make a temporary connection between components, and to help put things into context, we're going to work with the example of two flanges being bolted together. So when these flanges are assembled together, all the bolts get torqued to a certain specification, which puts the bolts in tension and the members in compression. Now think if you were trying to zip tie a bundle of sticks together. The zip tie stretches out and is put in tension, and all the sticks are squeezed and put in compression. So to keep things simple for this case, we'll focus on a single bolt. So if we assume the bolt is torqued to say 1,000 pounds of preload, and the bolt were to fail at 1,300 pounds, you would think naturally that if I pulled these flanges apart with 300 pounds, assuming there's one bolt, that the bolt would fail. But that's not the case, because bolted joints are stronger than you think. The reason behind this is due to the fact that the bolts and flanges act like springs, just really stiff springs. And this is one of the key insights in mechanical engineering, is that most everyday solids can be modeled as a spring, where a certain amount of force corresponds with a certain amount of deflection. And this relationship is described by Hooke's law, where F, the force, is equivalent to K, which is our stiffness, multiplied by the deflection. So if we want to know how much something will compress under a given force, we use this equation, where K is usually low for soft materials like rubber and very high for materials like steel, as is pretty intuitive. So one thing we can do with this is rearrange it in terms of X, our deflection, where X equals F over K, and set that equal to the deflection equation, which is FL over AE. And we can see that these are pretty similar. Like, you have an F in both numerator, so our K is then equal to AE over L if we rearrange it. So if we take our equation AE over L and apply it to both, we'll see that the E value, which is the modulus of elasticity, is the same, because I'm just going to assume they're both steel in this case. And their lengths are also about the same. Just visually, you can make that out. So really what affects the stiffness in our bolted joint is really the area difference between the two. So if we turn our attention to the lower left diagram, which is the cross section of our bolted joint, we can see the rough difference in size. And this lower right image helps exemplify that, where this blue dot represents our bolt cross-sectional area through here, and this orange area is the area between members under the green. So one thing to note is that when the flanges are clamped together, there's only a certain area under the bolt that is the effective area being compressed. Because you can think if the flange were super wide, that out here there's not as much clamp. Even if we tighten the bolts a lot, like, you would still probably be able to pry the members apart. So there's a certain pressure cone under the bolt head that extends 30 degrees, also from the nut, that meet in the middle of the flanges, and that's our effective area being compressed. So just visually you can see that the area between members is much greater than our area of the bolt. And one reason this area, and therefore stiffness, is important is because it affects how our bolted joint takes an applied load. So as I was saying earlier, if our bolts are torqued to 1,000 pounds and it fails at 1,300 pounds, you would think 300 pounds pulling on the flanges here would fail the bolt, but that's not the case because of the difference in stiffness between the two. So if I took this bolted joint and I applied the 300 pounds to it, most of the load actually goes to decompressing the flanges versus stretching the bolt. And this upper right graph helps visualize that for you. So this first point, as it moves up, that's the preload being applied. So we're going up to our 1,000 pounds, where the force in the bolt is equal to the force in the member. But once we start applying our external load and pulling the flange apart, only an incremental amount gets applied to the bolt and increases its tension. Most of it, you can see, drops down and unloads the member. So one way that makes it more intuitive to me is, instead of thinking of me applying an external load to the joint, think of if you just try to separate a certain amount, like say I wanted to separate it an inch. If I move the joint an inch, the bolt, since it's not as stiff, would only have, according to this relationship, a little bit of force to it. But if I move the flanges, which are really stiff in comparison, that inch makes a lot more of a difference. So if, for this example, we were to assume that the flanges were 10 times stiffer than the bolt, due essentially to the difference in area between the two, we find out that it would take approximately 3,000 pounds of pulling force on this joint to fail the bolt. That's way more than 300 pounds that seemed more intuitive at the start. So that 3,000 pounds times 10%, which is a tenth of the stiffness, would go to the bolt, and then you'd have the 2,700 pounds that go to actually decompressing the member. So that's why bolted joints are so much stronger than you think.